The dynamic between the president and the Fed chair. It always feels a bit tense, doesn't it?
It definitely can be. Unnecessary tension, perhaps.
Maybe, but it feels like it's ramped up lately. You probably saw President Trump's comments on Truth Social last Thursday about Jerome Powell.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. Hard to miss, really.
Right. He said, and this is a direct quote, Powell's termination cannot come fast enough.
Wow. And he called him too late as well, I believe.
Exactly, too late. It's pretty blunt language.
It certainly gets your attention, and it brings up some fundamental questions about how things work, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And he didn't just leave it there. He gave his reasons.
Right. He laid out an argument.
Yeah, he argued Powell should have already cut interest rates. He pointed to the European Central Bank, said they're moving, why aren't we?
Making that comparison.
And he mentioned falling prices for oil and groceries. Even eggs got a specific mention.
He mentioned eggs. Huh, okay. Trying to make it relatable, suppose.
I guess so. And he also threw in the idea that the U.S. is gaining wealth from tariffs. So his point seems to be, the Fed's holding back the economy. Powell's behind the curve.
Well, it's definitely a clear statement of his perspective.
Yeah.
He sees the ECB acting, sees some prices falling, and connects that to a need for lower rates here.
Yeah.
Which naturally leads to the question of Fed independence.
Yeah.
How insulated are they from this kind of political pressure?
Exactly. That was my first thought, and I bet a lot of listeners too. Can a president actually do that? Can they just fire the Fed chair if they don't like their interest rate policy?
It sounds like a huge move, doesn't it?
It really does. Like, is that even possible?
Well, the answer, like a lot of things in Washington, comes down to the law, specifically the Federal Reserve Act.
Okay, the Federal Reserve Act. What does it say? Can the president just decide?
No, not unilaterally, not just based on policy disagreement. The act is quite specific. It says a president can remove a member of the Board of Governors, and that includes the chair, but only for cause.
For cause. Okay, that sounds important. But what does for cause actually mean? Is it defined anywhere?
That's the tricky part. It's not explicitly spelled out in minute detail in the act itself.
Ah, so it's open to interpretation.
To some extent, but the general understanding, supported by history and legal interpretation, is that for cause means things like actual misconduct, breaking the law, or, serious neglect of their duties.
Not just, I wish interest rates were lower.
Precisely. A simple disagreement over the direction of monetary policy. That's almost certainly not considered sufficient cause under the act.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. You wouldn't want the Fed making decisions based on who's going to be happy in the White House that week.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That for cause protection is fundamental to the idea of Federal Reserve independence.
And why is that independence considered so crucial?
It's seen as vital for long-term economic stability. The whole structure, the long 14-year terms for governors, the separate 4-year term for the chair, needing Senate confirmation, it's all designed to create a buffer.
To insulate them from short-term political wins.
Right. So they can make decisions, sometimes unpopular ones, based on what they believe is best for the economy's health over time, not just, say, ahead of an election cycle.
So even though President Trump originally appointed Powell.
Yes, back in his first term.
And then President Biden reappointed him.
Correct.
None of that gives Trump the authority now to just say, you're fired, because he wants lower rates.
No. The appointment process confirms them for a term. Removing them before that term is up requires meeting that high for cause standard. The initial appointment doesn't change that. It's a protection for the system, really.
This isn't the first time a president and a Fed chair haven't seen eye to eye, is it? Are there historical parallels here?
Oh, absolutely. History is full of these tensions. A really famous example is President Nixon and Fed Chair Arthur Burns back in the early 70s.
Nixon and Burns, what happened there?
Well, Nixon really wanted lower interest rates, especially leading up to the 1972 election. He put a lot of pressure on Burns.
I can imagine. Did Burns give in?
He faced immense pressure, and historians debate the extent of its influence. But crucially, Nixon couldn't just fire him over it.
Because he didn't have cause.
Exactly. No legal grounds for removal based on monetary policy disagreements. Nixon might have tried other ways to influence him, but the direct firing wasn't an option under the law. It really shows the limitation.
Interesting. What about something a bit more recent?
Well, think about President Reagan and Paul Volcker. Volcker was the then chair known for really tackling inflation aggressively in the early 80s with high interest rates.
Right. Volcker. Tough medicine.
Very tough. And while Reagan kept him on initially, there was definite consideration about whether to reappoint him for another term. Ultimately, Reagan chose Alan Greenspan instead.
So Reagan didn't reappoint Volcker.
Correct. But that's different from firing him midterm. The president can choose not to reappoint someone when their term expires. That's part of the process. Removing a sitting chair before their term ends without cause. That's the line the act draws.
Okay, so there's a clear distinction between choosing not to reappoint and actively firing someone.
A very important distinction, legally and practically.
So digging into this independence again, Why is it so vital? What are the real-world stakes if that independence gets eroded?
The stakes are incredibly high. If a president could easily push out a Fed chair over policy, monetary policy could become just another political tool.
Used for short-term gain, maybe?
Exactly. Imagine interest rates being slashed right before an election purely for political reasons, even if the economy doesn't need it. That could overheat things, cause inflation down the line.
Or create asset bubbles.
Potentially, yes. It can seriously damage the credibility of the Federal Reserve, harm the U.S. Treasury market, weaken the dollar internationally. Investors rely on the Fed being, well, independent and predictable.
So political interference could have really damaging, long-lasting economic consequences for everyone.
It absolutely could. That independence, that credibility, it's a cornerstone of the U.S. financial system's stability. Decisions need to be grounded in economic data and long-term goals, not political expediency.
Now, there's also a Supreme Court case floating around that seems like it might touch on this area, right? Trump v. Wilcox.
Yes, that's definitely one to watch. It doesn't directly involve the Fed, but it deals with the president's power to remove heads of other independent agencies.
Okay, so what's the issue in that case?
It's challenging the for-cause removal protection for officials and agencies, like the Merit Systems Protection Board and the NLRB. The core question is revisiting a very old, very important precedent called Humphrey's Executor v. United States.
Humphrey's Executor, what did that establish?
That was the 1935 case that basically said the president couldn't just fire members of certain independent bodies like the Federal Trade Commission back then without cause. It solidified this idea of independence for some agencies.
So how could Trump v. Wilcox affect the Fed, even indirectly?
Well, the concern among some observers is that if the Supreme Court rules that the president does have more power to remove heads of these other independent agencies, could that precedent be used to argue for more presidential power over the Fed governors too?
Could it weaken the Fed's for-cause protection?
That's the fear. Could it open the door to arguments that Fed governors are more like cabinet secretaries, serving, at the pleasure of the president? It would inject a lot of uncertainty.
That sounds like it could be a pretty big deal for the Fed's independence we've been talking about.
It could. However, there's a counter-argument. The courts have often treated agencies structured like the Fed, with a multi-member board or commission, differently than agencies run by a single director.
So the Fed structure might give it extra protection?
Possibly. Think about the CELA law case involving the CFPB. A few years ago, the court found issues with a single director structure having for-cause protection, but seemed wary of extending that to multi-member commissions like the Fed or the SEC.
Why the difference?
There seems to be a recognition, maybe implicitly, that the Fed's independence is uniquely critical for overall economic and financial stability. Some scholars think the court has deliberately avoided overturning Humphrey's executor precisely because of the potential chaos it could cause for the Fed and the markets.
So it's something to watch, but maybe not panic about just yet, regarding the Fed specifically?
Exactly. The Fed's structure is different, and its role is arguably unique. But the case definitely highlights ongoing legal debates about presidential power and independent agencies.
It's also fascinating how even just the talk about this stuff impacts markets. I saw reports that cryptocurrencies took a hit right after Trump's post.
Yes, that was noticeable. Bitcoin, Ethereum, their prices dipped, and trading volume reportedly spiked.
What does that tell us?
It's a perfect example of market sensitivity. Markets hate uncertainty, especially uncertainty surrounding the Federal Reserve, which sets the baseline for, well, almost everything in finance.
So even if Trump can't actually fire Powell over policy,
right,
his words alone, just raising the possibility or criticizing the Fed's direction, can be enough to cause ripples, even in newer markets like crypto.
Absolutely. It shows how interconnected everything is. The perception of potential instability or a potential shift in monetary policy, even if triggered by political rhetoric, gets priced in very quickly. It underscores why Fed independence is valued by markets. It promotes stability and predictability.
So wrapping this up, it seems the system is built to protect the Fed's independence for good reason, even if it creates political friction.
That's the fundamental idea. The for-cause protection, the long terms, the confirmation process, they're all meant to ensure decisions are driven by economics, not politics, for the long-term health of the economy.
It really clarifies the legal boundaries and the economic reasoning behind them. Thanks for breaking that all down.
Happy to do it. It's a crucial piece of how our system works.
Definitely. So while presidents might wish for different monetary policy, the structure is there to prioritize stability over political aims. It does make you wonder, though, in today's climate, how much informal pressure might still exist, even without the direct firing power. Something to keep thinking about.
A very important question for the future, indeed.
Thanks again for the insights. And for everyone listening, we hope this exploration was valuable. Please do like and subscribe if you found this helpful. It really helps us out. We'll be back soon with another topic.